Welcome to today's episode. If you've been following me on TikTok or here on the podcast, you've probably noticed a pattern in the conversations we've been having. Some of my most engaging videos weren't about music or theory at all. They were about loyalty, manipulation, and the ways churches use spiritual sounding language to control people. And that's what I want to lean into today. Because this language isn't random, it's a part of a system. And once you learn it, you can't unhear it. So let me start by framing this. When I say hidden language, I'm not talking about tongues, prophecy, or worship lyrics. I'm talking about everyday phrases that get repeated so often they stop being questioned. Words like submission, covering, loyalty, and even concern. On the surface, they sound harmless. In fact, they sound spiritual. But beneath that surface, they often function like coded messages designed to keep people in line, discourage questions, and reinforce authority. Here's a story to make that real. Years ago, I had a pastor who pulled me aside and said, "I'm concerned about the direction you're heading." Now, at first, that sounds like care. Concern sounds like love, right? But as we talk more, I realized what he really meant. What he really meant was, I don't like the people you're spending time with, and I don't want you listening to anyone outside me. His concern wasn't about my health or my well being or even my walk with God. His concern was about control. And because he framed it as care, it was hard to push back. After all, who wants to argue with someone that says they're concerned? That's the tricky thing about hidden church language. It works because it blends two things together: a spiritual appearance and a power agenda. And when those two things merge, you end up with words that feel holy but operate like tools of control. That's why the video I did about church loyalty hit so hard. People know deep down that loyalty has been turned into a weapon. Loyalty to God quietly becomes loyalty to a church, loyalty to a pastor, and loyalty to a system. And once that switch happens, questioning leadership looks like questioning God. This is why we're diving in today. Because if you've ever felt confused, guilty, or even trapped by certain phrases in church, you're not alone. You might have thought, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm overthinking it. But the reality is that there are patterns. These words and phrases are repeated across different churches, different denominations, and even across cultures. They're not accidents, they're strategies. So in this episode, I want to peel back the layers. First, we're going to talk about loyalty, why it gets so much emphasis in church culture, and how it quietly shifts from being a good value to being a form of control. Then we'll move to concern, how something that sounds so gentle can actually become one of the most effective ways leaders police your behavior without ever looking authoritarian. And finally, we'll connect the dots, because these aren't just isolated words. They form a whole system of culture where silence, guilt, and control thrive under the cover of spirituality. Stick with me, because by the end of this episode, you'll not only recognize these patterns, but you'll also have some tools to respond differently the next time you hear them. Let's talk about loyalty. On the surface, loyalty is a good thing. We all value loyalty in friendships and family, even in work relationships. Loyalty communicates trust, reliability, and commitment. In healthy communities, loyalty means I can count on you and you can count on me. That's what makes it powerful. But in many church settings, loyalty takes on a different meaning. It stops being about mutual trust and becomes a tool that leaders use to demand obedience. Think about the way loyalty is preached. You often hear it framed as loyalty to God, but very quickly it shifts into loyalty to the church, loyalty to the vision, or loyalty to the pastor. Somewhere in that slide, the line gets blurred. Questioning a decision becomes disloyal. Leaving a ministry role becomes betrayal. Even asking for rest can feel like abandonment. And because loyalty is framed as a spiritual value, the pressure is enormous. Who wants to be seen as unfaithful to God? Here's the problem. True loyalty is freely given. It can't be forced. But in many churches, loyalty isn't requested. It's required. If you've ever been told that leaving a church is the same as leaving God, you've experienced this dynamic. If you've ever been made to feel guilty for taking a break from serving, you felt how loyalty is weaponized. And it doesn't just impact individuals, it impacts whole communities. I've seen musicians, volunteers, and staff members pushed to their breaking point, all in the name of loyalty. People will ignore their health, neglect their families, and drain their finances just to prove they're loyal. And the church applauds it. They'll call it faithfulness, sacrifice, or being sold out for the kingdom. But in reality, it's exploitation. It's getting free labor and unquestioning commitment without accountability. What makes this even more manipulative is that loyalty in church is rarely mutual. You'll notice that the flow of loyalty, is almost always one directional, up towards leadership. Leaders demand loyalty from members, but rarely offer the same in return. If a member faces a crisis or can't perform, loyalty disappears. Suddenly, the one who gave years of service is quietly discarded. So the message becomes clear. Your loyalty is only valued as long as it benefits the system. And let's be honest, this isn't just a small church issue. It happens in big churches, small churches, and everything in between. I've heard countless stories in my TikTok comments of people who were told, "Don't you dare leave. God planted you here," or "If you leave, you'll miss your blessing." Notice how loyalty gets tied directly to fear: fear of punishment, fear of missing out, fear of God's judgment. That's not loyalty, that's control. Now, here's why this matters. When loyalty becomes control, it kills honesty. People stop speaking up because they're afraid of looking disloyal. They silence their questions, hide their struggles, and then put on a mask just to maintain the image of being loyal. And when honesty dies, community becomes shallow. You get smiling faces, faithful volunteers, and packed services. But underneath, people are exhausted, confused, and quietly broken. So here's the takeaway: loyalty is a beautiful thing when it's mutual and voluntary, but when it's demanded, guilt driven, or tied to your standing with God, it's no longer loyalty. It's manipulation dressed up in spiritual clothes. Now let's move on to another phrase that sounds harmless on the surface, but it carries a lot of hidden weight in church culture: concern. On its face, concern sounds like compassion. If someone says, "I'm concerned for you," it feels like they're expressing care. But in many churches, concern becomes a disguise. It's not always about care, and sometimes it's about control. Here's an example from my own life. A pastor pulled me aside and said he was concerned about the influence someone else had to me that I was close to. That word concern wasn't really about my health, my spiritual growth, or even my walk with God. It was about limiting who I could listen to. By framing his control as concern, he made it sound spiritual, even loving. And here's the catch: how do you push back against someone who says they're concerned? It feels unchristian to argue with care. That's what makes it powerful. This happens in so many subtle ways. Leaders might say they're concerned about how much time you spend outside of church activities, concerned about your clothing choice, concerned about who you date, concerned about the books you're reading. And while some of those things could be normal conversation in a supportive community, the problem is in the power dynamic. When concern only flows from top down, it stops being dialogue and becomes policing. The language of concern works only because it creates guilt. If you ignore someone's concern, you feel like you're dismissing their love. If you push back, that looks rebellious. So most people just comply. They change their behavior not because they are convicted, but because they're controlled. Over time, this chips away at your ability to trust your own judgment. You start second guessing yourself, wondering if every choice needs to be filtered through somebody else's approval. And this isn't just theoretical. I've had people message me after seeing my TikToks saying they left churches where concern was used like a leash. They were constantly told, "I'm concerned for your soul," when they made independent decisions. One woman said, "I realized concern didn't mean they cared about me. It meant they wanted me to fall in line." That story hit me hard because it shows just how common this is. The other reason concern is effective is that it sounds softer than outright commands. If a leader says, "You can't do this," people might resist. But if they say, "Well, I'm concerned," it feels gentler. Yet the effect is the same: compliance. And often, the person on the receiving end ends up policing themselves. They stop making certain choices, not because they believe they were wrong, but because they don't want to trigger someone else's concern. That's how language turns into culture. Here's the deeper issue: genuine concern builds people up. It empowers them to grow, but false concern keeps people dependent. It stunts maturity because you're always looking for external validation. That's why this matters so much. Concern, when it's misused, doesn't just control actions, it shapes identity. It makes you question whether you can be trusted with your own life. So the next time you hear concern framed in a church setting, pause and ask, is this concern about my flourishing or about maintaining someone else's control? That simple question can help you cut through the spiritual fog and expose what's really happening. So we've looked at loyalty, we've looked at concern. On their own, they just might seem like isolated phrases, but together they reveal a larger system. That system is what I call the culture of self-policing and silence inside many churches. And this is where the hidden language becomes especially dangerous. Here's how it works. Words like loyalty and concern don't just control behavior in the moment. Over time, they train people to control themselves. If I know my loyalty will be questioned, I stop raising concerns. If I know my pastor might be concerned, I stop exploring ideas that might trigger his disapproval. Eventually, I don't even need someone to silence me. I silence myself. That's the heart of silence culture. I've seen this play out with musicians, volunteers, and everyday members. Someone notices financial decisions that don't seem transparent. Instead of asking questions, they keep quiet because they don't want to look disloyal. Or someone feels burnt out from endless ministry commitments. Rather than stepping back, they keep going because they don't want to spark concern from leadership. The result is a community where everyone is smiling and serving and singing, yet beneath the surface, people are exhausted, resentful, and afraid to speak honestly. This silence culture also creates isolation. When everyone feels the pressure to appear loyal and keep concerns hidden, nobody admits their struggles. You could be sitting right next to someone in church every week, both of you burnt out, both of you doubting, but neither of you will say a word because the culture has trained you that questions equal rebellion, and rebellion equals sin. That's how language creates culture, and culture sustains control. Now, I don't want to leave us stuck in critique. The point of exposing this isn't just to name the problem, but to give you tools to navigate it differently. And that's where I use a simple framework. I call it the 3 R's: don't react, reframe, and refocus. First, don't react. When someone uses loaded language like questioning your loyalty or expressing concern, the easiest trap is to react emotionally. That's what the system is designed to provoke. But instead of reacting, pause, take a breath. Remind yourself that their words don't automatically define your reality. Second, reframe. This is where you interpret the language for what really is. If loyalty is being demanded, reframe it. Loyalty that can't be mutual and voluntary isn't loyalty, it's control. If concern feels more like policing than care, reframe it. This isn't about my well being, it's about maintaining authority. Naming it accurately takes away some of its power. Finally, refocus. After you pause and reframed, turn your attention back to what really matters most: your health, your boundaries, and your integrity. Refocusing means you don't let someone else's coded language hijack your life. You choose to live from a place of clarity than a place of fear. I've shared this framework in comments and messages, and people have told me it gave them language for what they were experiencing. One person said, "For the first time, I realized I wasn't crazy. The problem wasn't my lack of loyalty. The problem was the system redefining loyalty to keep me silent." That's the power of reframing and refocusing. It helps you step out of the fog and back into clarity. So when you put it all together, here's the picture. Loyalty and concern are not just words. They're part of a hidden vocabulary that creates silence, guilt, and control. But once you see the pattern, you can choose differently. You can refuse to self-police. You can refuse to stay silent, and you can start building a healthier way of relating to faith and community. We've uncovered a lot today. We started talking about hidden church language, those words that sound spiritual but function as a tool of control. We looked at loyalty, how it shifts from being a mutual value into a demand that silences questions and extracts endless labor. We looked at concern, how it's used as a softer form of policing that makes resistance feel unloving. And then we connected the dots, seeing how these words work together to create silence culture, a culture where people self police, stay quiet, and eventually lose touch with their own judgment. But I want to end this episode by reminding you of something important. If you've experienced this, it doesn't mean you were weak. It doesn't mean that you lacked faith or discernment. It means you were in an environment that was designed to confuse you. These systems are subtle by design. They work because they take good values like loyalty, care, and community and then twist them into something else. So if you've been caught in that, the fact that you're even questioning it now shows strength and not weakness. And here's the hopeful part. Once you see the pattern, you can start making different choices. You don't have to live in silence. You don't have to stay in guilt. You don't have to hand over your agency to someone who uses spiritual language as your leash. You can reclaim your voice. You can step back. You can breathe and apply the 3 R's. Don't react, reframe, and refocus. Those steps won't fix everything overnight, but they'll help you to break the spell of control and remember that your life is yours to live. Now, if this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to invite you to go a little deeper with me. I put together a free resource called 7 Subtle Ways Churches Weaponize Submission. It unpacks more of these patterns in details and gives you practical language to recognize them in your own life. You can grab it by joining my community at aftertheamencommunity.com. The link for that is in the description. When you sign up, you'll also get access to my weekly emails where I share encouragement, insights, and strategies for navigating faith, burnout, and spiritual abuse. Think of it as a safe place to process what you've experienced and connect with others on the same journey. And if you've been listening and nodding along and maybe even feeling a little less alone, that's the point. This space is about building clarity, not confusion. It's about exposing the tactics that keep people stuck and reclaiming the freedom that guilt and manipulation try to steal. Before we close, I want to leave with you one final thought. Loyalty and concern, when they're genuine, can be beautiful. Real loyalty builds trust. Real concern shows care. The tragedy is that in unhealthy systems, those very words get weaponized. But the truth is, words don't have to stay twisted. You have the right to redefine them in your own life. You can choose relationships where loyalty is mutual and where concern empowers instead of controls. That choice is yours, and making it is one step closer to healing. Thank you for listening to this episode of After the Amen. If this helped you, share it with someone else who might need it. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss future conversations. Next time, we're going to break down submission versus control and why boundaries are not rebellion. If you've ever been told to be obedient when you really needed clarity, that one is for you. That's going to be another powerful one. Until then, remember this: you're not crazy, you're not alone, and your voice matters.